Well, I'm back. I've taken a break. It's been an excellent holiday, but I picked up a nasty bug while I was away. It means that I'm sick and off work. I sound a little bit different, but what that has given me is a little bit of time to make some content. Now, this isn't going to be everybody's cup of tea, but for certified Division nerds like my subscribers, this should be right up your alley. So, let's go. So I'm going to take you on the journey of discovery in regards to damage that I've made since coming into this game. So I'm going to start right at the beginning, and that is that at level 0, so when first coming into this game, you have the very basic understanding that damage is quite simply your bullet damage times whatever your RPM is. It's very basic. You understand that that is your damage output. You can do some very simple calculations in order to work out what you think the best weapon is for any given situation. Then if you're watching some YouTube videos and the like, you'll find that there's been a couple of equations that have been created that have been gifted to us along the way, which gives us a burst DPS calculation, which is the total amount of damage that you put out in one magazine divided by the time to fire that magazine. And that will give you a rate of damage per second. And then you have a sustained DPS calculation, which is your total magazine damage over the time to fire those rounds, and also then including the time to reload as well. And you'll probably come across spreadsheets, you may have even created them yourself, just like this one, where you've gone in, you've looked at the base weapon damage for any given weapon, and you've done those maths and you've come out with a burst DPS and a sustained DPS, you've ranked them and all the rest of them. The next level is where you want to work out what your bullet damage is. You're not happy with the fact that you're only using the base damage for each of those weapons to calculate this. So you want to work out what the best weapon is given whatever damage you're actually putting out on your build. Now, there's already a large number of videos out there in regards to bullet damage calculation, and my very first video is in fact exactly on this subject. I know that Hutchler's put one out recently, I know that Dispatch has got a very good one, there's a few other content creators that have actually put out bullet damage calculation videos. So I'm not going to go through this again here, but you are essentially given an equation that tells you what your bullet damage will be depending on what you hit and what your build is and what talents and attributes you have on that build. And you start to make more accurate calculations in regards to the damage that you're putting out. Now level 3 is where I got to and realized that damage per second is literally just damage over time. It's that simple. Damage over time. And that damage, whatever you decide it happens to be, X, is divided by the time it takes you to fire that. Damage over time. It's pretty straightforward. What I didn't understand is why we're given two separate equations to work out exactly the same thing. And why do they not match? Damage over time seems like it should be a very straightforward situation, but we're given two separate equations that never align and never work together. And you realize that burst DPS only works if the damage that you've got to do is less than your total mag damage, and that the damage required is less than one magazine. And that sustained DPS, the calculation actually only works if the damage required is infinity, because it's always adding a reload when in reality it's not needed unless you're continuing to do damage over and over and over again ad infinitum. Because once you've finished doing damage, you don't have to do the last reload. The damage is done, you've stopped work. But that drew me back to the fact that damage over time should be very straightforward. In this case, the time to fire is N over your RPM over, or bullets per second. RPM over 60 is bullets per second. where n is the number of bullets that it takes to reach x, which is simply the amount of damage divided by your bullet damage. Pretty straightforward. Burst DPS is the total magazine damage divided by the time to fire the magazine. It's just, in that case, X has been defined as the total magazine damage. And this is easily demonstrated. For mass, total mag damage is 2.209 million. The time to fire a magazine, being 50 rounds, is 3.33 seconds. So the FAMAS burst DPS, or damage over time, is 2.209 million divided by the 3.33 seconds, which gives us an average of 663,528 per second. We go back to the other equation, which is damage over time, where in this case time is the number of bullets, which is the amount of damage required divided by the bullet damage. We're using base damage. So that is, we've stated that X equals 2.209 million. The base damage for the FAMAS is 44,191, which by no coincidence is 50 bullets required to do that. And so the time to fire those 50 bullets is 3.33 seconds. And therefore damage over time is 663,528 per second. It's exactly the same equation. But it only works in the burst DPS calculation if X is less than what the damage you can put out in one magazine. As soon as it exceeds that amount, because it's chosen not to include reloads in that time to fire, it doesn't work. And that's because the time to fire, when X is greater than one magazine's damage, has to include the reloads. And so if the time to fire is time to fire plus time to reload, you'll notice that that looks very, very similar to this. But we've already established that there is a problem with sustained DPS, and that's because it's including too many reloads. The number of reloads that we require is never equal to the number of magazines. It's always less. The number of reloads is actually equal to the number of magazines required minus 1, because we never have to do that last reload. And in this case, I'm calling that R, so the number of reloads required. And the number of magazines required, I hope everybody understands, is the number of bullets divided by your number of your magazine size. And this actually solves the problem of sustained DPS by simply subtracting the last magazine from the equation. So DPS continues to equal damage over time, but in this case the time is the number of bullets required over the bullets per second plus the number of reloads, which is your magazines minus 1, times the time to reload that magazine. Make sense? I want you to understand, before anybody gets up in arms, that I've created something new. This is the burst DPS calculation. It's just that the burst DPS calculation has chosen to establish X as being the total magazine damage, and that R equals 0, which is in fact true because the number of magazines required, or the number of reloads, is one magazine minus 1. So this is the burst DPS equation. But what it also is a more accurate sustained DPS calculation. And when you realize that it is a sustained DPS calculation and a burst DPS calculation, you realize that burst DPS is in fact sustained DPS. You are sustaining fire. It's just that you've chosen to do 0 reloads. That's all it is. That's the difference. Level 4 is realizing that there is in fact a small problem with N being the number of bullets to reach X. The number of bullets is the total damage, that's X, over your bullet damage. But if we do a simple calculation and say that x equals to 200,000, and we've got alpha mass, and our base damage is 44,191, we equal 4.525 bullets. But obviously, you cannot fire 0.525 of a bullet. So that small problem is very easily taken care of by making sure that n is always a whole number. And I'm going to represent that with just n dash. But that 0.475 of a bullet is lost. That is damage per second that is never going to be realized. And I've spoken about this before because this is the last bullet principle, in that every single weapon system overkills every single enemy in this game. The higher that your bullet to damage is, the higher amount of damage that you lose to the last bullet principle. And that's easily seen if we imagine that the bullet damage instead of 44,191 was 190,000, then it's going to take a little over one bullet and you're going to lose the majority of that second bullet that you have to fire in order to kill that enemy. It's the last bullet principle. The higher the base damage is, the more that you're going to lose as a percentage of your DPS. Not important really when it comes to FAMAS or any AR or automatic weapon, but certainly is a key principle when you're talking about shotguns or with MMRs. The second problem with N- is that there is no bullet cycle on the first bullet. So when you're working out the time to fire the bullets in a magazine, or the bullets required to deliver X amount of damage, the first bullet is instantaneous. And that means that you have to subtract one bullet cycle. And that I have also spoken about as the first bullet principle. A larger bullet damage weapon has a higher head start because there's no cycling on that first bullet. Simply n-1 will give you the amount of time to fire all of those bullets, all of the bullet cycles. And what you get is this equation here. Still damage over time, but the time is n-, which is the number of bullets rounded to a whole number in order to kill the enemy, -1 being -1 bullet cycle, that's over the bullets per second, plus the number of reloads, which is your mags required, -1, times the time to reload that number of times. And what you end up realizing at the end of this, even if this does not make any sense to you mathematically, it becomes very, very intuitive, because that time to fire for X damage is in fact, that equation is in fact a very, very accurate time to kill. And here is where it becomes very intuitive, in that damage per second is simply X amount of damage, and that is divided by the time it takes you to kill that amount of damage, or the time it takes you to do that amount of damage. Very, very straightforward, very, very intuitive. But for some reason it's eluded us for so long. So damage per second is X amount of damage divided by n-1 over RPM over 60 plus number of reloads times the time it takes to do that reload. And once again, we go back to burst DPS. X equals TMD, and the time to fire is just R equals 0. It's exactly the same equation. So before anybody jumps up in arms about this is a TTK equation and not a DPS equation, it is exactly the same as a burst DPS equation. It's just that it has a term now that sorts out and unifies both burst DPS and sustained DPS calculations. Once you realize that burst, or the old burst DPS equation, is in fact a sustained DPS equation with R set at 0, you then realize, well, so what is burst firing? And I've said this in a number of videos, but burst firing is just the choice to reload, rather than being forced to at the end of your magazine. You will generally kill something and then reload, kill something, reload, do it again. And so the difference between burst firing is just simply defining how many X's you want to kill with reloads in between. So you simply say that I have Z number of X's, or let's say that it's Z being 2 and X being an enemy, and therefore the number of bullets in order to kill that enemy is still n-1. That still is the number of bullets to kill X. You just have to multiply that by Z to give the total number of bullets to kill Z number of enemies. And then the number of reloads you've now chosen, but that number of reloads is always going to be just Z-1. So burst firing is when you are taking down a number of enemies utilizing burst fire, which is less than a magazine. You're still automatic firing, you're still sustaining damage. The only difference is that you've chosen to reload more regularly. And how many times you do that is dictated generally by the number of enemies. Number of enemies increases the amount of damage that needs to be done, and it increases the number of reloads that must be done, but the number of reloads is always less than the total number of enemies because you don't need to reload the last time. That's it. Now level 6, the last level that I'm going to be discussing today, and I'm not even really going to go into it, and that is because it is level 2 in depth. And if you remember level 2, that was bullet damage calculation. And as I said, there are many videos on how to calculate a bullet damage. The issue is that in order to be accurate, you need to have the average bullet damage that occurs in game. It's pointless working out your bullet damage as being all headshots, all crits, all maxed out, all buffs applied, if that doesn't happen in game. And the way that you do that is you take every single bullet type and its damage, with buff, without buff, crit, non-crit, in cover, out of cover, and then you multiply it by its rate of occurrence in game. Now there's a lot of research and the like that goes into that, and that is what I termed in my very last video as being realization. How often each one of those bullet damage types is in fact realized when you are playing the game. And because I can't tell you how often you are going to realize that damage, and that will depend on the build that you've got and all the rest of it, it's pointless me going through and giving you best in slots and all the rest of it, because it depends on how you play, how accurate you are, the build that you're using, etc., etc. But what I can do is I think I can go one step better. And what I can do is I can give you a damage calculator that does everything from level 0 all the way through to level 6. So the next few videos I will give you a step-by-step instruction on how to create your own DPS calculator, and I have been using one for quite some time. I'll probably do one which is slightly more basic than the one that I currently use, because I include things like the coyotes, engagement distances, and a few other things. But for the most part, what you'll be able to do is you'll be able to input what the armor ratio is for whatever gameplay level that you're doing, the out of cover ratio depending on the game type that you're playing. You'll also be able to put in your personal stats, so things like your overall accuracy, how accurate you are at headshots, and the spreadsheet will calculate based on those inputs the rate of occurrence for each of the different damage number types, and then that gives you an accurate average bullet damage, and it will give you at the end of the day a damage per second calculation or figure that you can very easily start to identify facts and fiction amongst what you've been told in the past. You'll be able to quickly work out whether or not adding another crit damage piece to your system will produce more damage, what balance of crit chance, crit damage, whether or not increasing your weapon handling and your reload speed with a slight adjustment to your accuracy and then also your reload times. You'll be able to work out whether or not you'll be able to take down an enemy inside one magazine, i.e. the burst bubble. All of these things are then calculated for you based on Excel spreadsheet calculations. So I'll be going through step by step as to how this is all worked out, the figures and the equations that you need to put into each of the boxes, and I'll do that over the next few videos and give that back to the community so that you can be your own determiner of what is best in slot for you. Make tweaks theoretically before you actually jump in and make them at an optimization bench or an expertise level. So having said all that, appreciate all the support that's been given to me, including in my absence. Subscriber numbers have continued to grow, so there's obviously an interest in this content, and for that reason I've decided to keep going. The number of videos won't be anywhere near as many as what I had put out in the past, for the reasons that I've already told you about, but I appreciate the support. If you like the video, then like. If you want to see more and you want a bullet or a DPS calculator of your own, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.